This morning we began looking at this word that the Greek word doesn't matter because I don't know Greek either, but it's in the New Testament 10 times, and it has a variety of meanings, but the most basic idea is just the idea of continuing. And so we noticed this morning there was a boat that continued, and the servants of Cornelius continued, and the governing authorities, they continue in different things. And so that sets the basic idea, but our focus was from the book of Acts and what we see Christians continuing in, and that ought to be in us today. And so we noticed that the apostles continued steadfastly as they waited, and so the prayers that they offered is the best pastime. Baseball is called America's pastime. The Christians' pastime, in part, is steadfast prayer. They continued in worship, and that's just the first detail that is mentioned after they obeyed the gospel. Not the only change in their life, but the first that's recorded. They continued also working together daily, both publicly and privately, just showing that they were of one accord, one mind, one purpose, and united in their participation. And then we focused in Acts chapter 6 that the apostles were determined to continue in prayer and in the teaching of the Word, and focused more so on the aspect of prayer and the great responsibility that leaders have, and how prayer ought to be woven into every step of leadership that he directs those whom he's guiding through. Tonight, then, we're going to look, we already read Romans chapter 12. Later as we study, we'll read from Colossians chapter 4, so I won't do so now. But in Romans chapter 12, mixed in this very, very brief series of exhortations, he's just reminding them of the kinds of things that ought to typify our life. In that, I'm sure you noticed, was continuing steadfastly in prayer. Now, obviously, prayer is not the main thing. That is, as long as a Christian you pray, then everything else is details. There's really nothing like that. This is not the only activity that God has planned for us, but it is among the things that we have seen as we've gone through that is connected often with this word that emphasizes the continuity, the consistency. There will be hours between the times that we pray, but there shouldn't be days between our prayers if we continue in prayer, as Romans chapter 12 reminds us. Tonight, we're going to mainly focus on why our prayers need to be so continuous. And again, there are other things we need to be involved in and focused on in serving the Lord, but we're going to look at especially the why prayer ought to have such a persistent role, and two main reasons. It's because of our constant needs and because of our constant blessings. When we give consideration to those, then there are other things that we'll do in response to that, but among them will be constant, ongoing prayer. Think about some of our needs. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, how is our enemy described? A roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And so this pictures Satan as a stalker, and however much National Geographic or other nature programs you've watched, they lay in the bushes and they pick out a target, and they don't just immediately go. They work together sometimes if they're hunting in a group, but they stalk their prey and then strike at a moment of weakness when that becomes available. A hunter is how Satan is described there. Now connect that with back in Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6 and the end of verse 11, as Paul's describing putting on the whole armor of God. And then he begins this by describing our enemy. Well, why do I need to put on armor? Well, it's because you have an enemy. And the greater threat that you perceive your enemy to be, then the greater motivated you are to be prepared for that and to put on the armor that matches the kind of attacks that your enemy is going to make. So at the end of verse 11, this one who elsewhere is described as a lion is here it's just said that we may stand against the wiles, and that is, my Bible has a footnote, the schemings of the devil. And that would be consistent with a lion, someone waiting and watching and lurking and looking for just the right opportunity and taking just the right route and path to attack for the purpose of destruction. When we think about our enemy, when we think about Satan, we ought to be intimidated to a degree. Of course, we're not just in anxious panic because we have the armor of God. God is leading and guiding and helping us. But when we consider our enemy, we don't really have any earthly parallel, because Satan has been doing his work of destruction for, a few days shorter than man has existed on earth. I don't know how long after day 6 that Satan appeared to Eve in the garden, but from that point on, Satan has been busy. Any enemy that we have in some physical way, well, at best, they've outlived us for a few decades. But when we think about Satan, we've got an enemy that has seen people better than you and I in a variety of ways, and his attacks have been persistent. I would be a little bit nervous about going into battle with someone who had me outmatched to that degree in those terms. And without God on our side, then we are overmatched. We don't have any way to fight an enemy whom we can't see and who has outlived us as long as Satan has. And so it's worth considering the threat. And then go into verse 12, because it's not only us against Satan, but he says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." So we can picture Satan as a lion, and so that gives us some identity of his methods and his destruction. But the other things he describes here, I don't know how to paint a picture. I don't know how to give you an example of principalities, powers, rulers of darkness, spiritual hosts of wickedness. I don't know how to paint that image. And we can't see our enemy, but this describes, again, it's not just one-on-one, you against the devil. It's you against the devil and his hosts, all who are of the same mind and who hate God to a similar, if not the identical degree that Satan does. That's who you have opposing you on the other side of the ring or on the other side of the battlefield. And without God, then that ought to further impress us. We don't have any hope of heaven. We don't have any hope of avoiding hell and eternity in hell if we don't put on the whole armor of God. And so understanding our enemy helps us to recognize we constantly have this enemy who's watching us and looking for an opportunity that needs to frighten us a little bit, simply enough that will motivate us to do what? Well, put on the whole armor of God. And what's the last thing that's mentioned after the last piece of armor that's described? He says, put this on with prayer. If we are constantly, daily, and throughout the day aware of the fact that we have a spiritual enemy and we have spiritual enemies, that will keep us praying. Go to 1 Timothy chapter 2. We also have constant needs because while we set our schedule every day, we have our plans for what we want to do with what we're pretty sure we're going to do and what is likely to happen as a result of what we decide to do. The fact is that there are also other people making decisions every single day that affect our lives, and we often have no or very little influence over their decisions, even though their decisions have a significant impact upon our lives. And so Paul says in 1 Timothy 2, 1-2, "Therefore I exhort first of all that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence." And so there are things for which we can pray for all men. Then he points out in verse 2, for kings and authorities, why would we pray for them? Again, because their decisions have a pretty direct influence and impact upon whatever decisions I think, whatever plans I make today. Their decisions can completely change that and uproot it, and there's little to nothing that I can do to alter that. And so I have needs for help. Not only do those decisions of others affect me, they affect other Christians and everyone who is affected and influenced by that. And so here's another need for God's help, because here is something that is, again, typically out of our reach of our sphere of influence. Now we think, well, maybe we can pray that a Christian will be president or a Christian will be elected mayor. And sometimes that can happen. But when you think of the history of the world, or when we think when Paul wrote Timothy, there were no Christians in the national authority making the decisions of Rome or of other governing authorities. And when we think back through human history, that has been the rarest of exceptions, or the rarest of occasions. And there have been exceptions. We might think, well, there was a Daniel, and there was a King Josiah, and there was a King David, and there was a Nehemiah. And so there have been people who have known and been able to influence people who were the influencers of nations and of empires. There have been times like that. But as a whole, for a variety of reasons, God's people have usually not been in the position of being the national decision makers. In our society, that's possible, that a Christian could have that degree of influence on a nation. As citizens, we have the right and the option of participating to some degree of influencing and even choosing our leaders, but of course, individually, that influence is still very, very limited. And so, at the time that Paul says this, Christians really had zero influence. We have some influence, but in reality, it's very minimal. And that's just as well, because where is our time best invested? If we could get a law passed against abortion, against homosexuality, against divorce for any reason except sexual immorality, if we could get all of that passed, that would have some good effects upon our society. But is that likely to change the hearts and the attitudes of people, and that more people are going to obey the gospel and then spend eternity with God in heaven? Well, the laws of man can have some immediate benefits, but the law of Christ, of course, is far more effective at changing the hearts of man than the social laws of man do. And so, again, it's good, consistent with our abilities and opportunities, while we can, to have some influence in the laws that govern our society. Nothing wrong with that, but that pales in comparison to what the law of Christ can do. And so what deserves our attention and our conversation and our participation and our prayer? More politics or the gospel of Christ? There are great needs in regards to the decisions that affect us. And so the more as we are constantly aware of those decisions being made, then we ought to be constantly prayerful. A couple of points from one passage, Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, we go back to verse 13, verses 13 and 14. Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider, surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him. Here Solomon's taking a very simple approach, that there is reason to rejoice in the days of prosperity, and that's true. But there's another aspect to that when we are in a time or a season of prosperity, that is also a time of need. There are unique needs we have, and there are unique battles that we fight when things are easy, when things go the way that we want them to go, when we prosper in whatever area of life that we do. Think about some of the needs that we have when we prosper. Prosperity can easily lead us to misplaced trust. So how did that prosperity happen? Well, maybe there were people who battled and fought for the freedoms and the peace that we enjoy. So it's easy to think, well, as long as we have people willing to fight those battles, then we'll have the peace. And so our trust can easily be misplaced in, as long as man continues to do what man has continued to do, well, then we'll get the same result. It's not true. Doesn't mean that doesn't contribute in any way, but don't put your trust there. Prosperity often leads us to misplace our trust. It often leads to unrealistic expectations, so that things are going in such and such a way, and it's beneficial to me, and it's what I like. So I often assume, I often expect, well, that will continue to happen. I like this, and the longer it happens, then it's easy to expect that it will continue to happen. Prosperity can easily be a source of distraction. And prosperity can often promote an unhealthy attachment to the prosperity, again, whether it's the convenience or the ease or the tangible things that might come as a result of that. Now, all of us have our own strengths and weaknesses, but which of these, when life is going well, which of these for you might you recognize as your weakness? And again, it doesn't just have to be prosperity in dollars in your bank account. It can be any area where just life is good. And it's okay for life to be good. Solomon said, rejoice while life is good. But there's also this aspect, we need to be constantly praying when things are going well, because when things are going well, we are in need of God's help just as much, I won't say necessarily more or less, but just in a different way. Then we need His help during adversity. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but a point is, if you see there is a danger, if you see there is a threat, and even more so, if you can see what danger you're often more susceptible to during prosperity, well, now you've got a reason to pray, to continue to pray for God's help in prosperity. And in Matthew chapter 19, we have this example after the rich young ruler went away sorrowful. Remember, Jesus gave him a personal invitation. He didn't just give him the command, sell all that you have. Sell all that you have and do what? And come follow me. Jesus didn't invite everybody whom He taught to literally come travel with me, go with me, be with me, and learn with me. He was given that opportunity, and he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. And then in verse 23, Jesus said to His disciples, assuredly I say to you, that it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. I wish that were on in God we trust, on our dollar bills. That's good. I don't know if it'll remain that way. But whoever's idea that had a good idea. This might also do our society well if they would take it to heart. It's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. I won't ask you to raise your hand if you're here and you're a rich man. The fact is, all of us would have our hands up, not just Grant. That's right. He knows. But it's true, and it doesn't take us long. We often compare ourselves to the lifestyles of the rich and famous. But in reality, when we look around 360 degrees, we find out we're all rich men. If we live in America in the year 2021, and when I get to thinking about how hard it is to live in Fairbanks, then I just remind myself, it's never been easier in the history of man to live in this spot in the world than it is today. We are rich, every single one of us is. And Jesus says, if you can recognize you are rich, then you have a challenge to enter the kingdom of heaven. And then this has, as many verses often do with parents, struck me in a different way. If it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, what about the children of rich men who grow up with wealth, who maybe misplace their trust, who maybe have unrealistic expectations? If that can happen to adults, how much easier is it for children to do that? To be distracted, to have an unhealthy attachment to the riches of this world. If any of that is recognized by you as a threat, now we begin to understand, and our list of reasons to continue in prayer continues to grow. As long as we are prosperous, we have a need that should lead us to continue to pray. Ecclesiastes listed the other aspect that's just a part of life. There's also adversity. And he says, in the days of adversity, consider. One of the things that we should consider during adversity is that adversity brings a different kind of need. Again, it's different with everybody. Some people, when there is adversity, they're looking for someone to blame. And so there's a problem, and somebody's got to be the root of that problem. Sometimes people say, I'm the root of the problem. Everything I do, it just goes poorly. I'm to blame for everything, and that can be self-destructive. Other people, when there's a problem, they want to point the finger to somebody else, and so they may live their life bitter because they either think they know who is the source of their problems, or they know who is the source of some of their problems. And instead of spending their life seeking God's help, they spend their life pointing the finger, and they spend their life bitter and seeking revenge, or their life is just wasted on blame that is misplaced, or even if they get it right, that's the focus of their life, and they're destroyed because of it. There's some people that, because of adversity, they just spend a life or even lose their life, literally take their own life sometimes because of hopelessness. There's some who respond to adversity with doubt or an outright denial of God, and so the age-old question, well, if there is a God, why is there suffering? Well, the fact is that there is suffering, so that doesn't change the nature of who God is. We may have some difficult questions to answer, but there are some who deny God's existence or God's help or the reality of God's individual and personal concern for them because of the adversity. And some people, adversity tempts them to compromise, that, well, I think I can find a way around, or I can escape this problem by some sin. Well, does that ever work? No. All it's going to do, there may be a problem, and you may not can make the problem go away. The problem can get worse, and it will get worse if I compromise. It will get worse if I sin. But that's an area in which some people are tempted in adversity. We might think of Job and Job's wife and Job's friends in these areas. So all of us respond differently to adversity. And again, I'll let you answer it for yourself. When things are not going the way that you had idealized in your mind or planned or determined, which of these, or maybe there's something else you can think of, what do you struggle with when there is adversity? And whatever your answer is, if you recognize some weakness, then all that does is help you to see I've got a constant need for God's help whenever there is adversity. And when I recognize that, what that ought to do is give me another reason to pray, and to pray consistently. Are you? We need to pray and pray consistently. Go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. We need to be continually praying because life is continually changing. And sometimes it changes for the better or the worse as we perceive it. And then sometimes it isn't necessarily better or worse. It's just different. But because it's a change, well, then that throws us for a loop in one way, forces us to reassess decisions and plans, and all of the the adjustments that are the result of the different seasons of life that Solomon summarizes here in verses 1 through 8 is a reminder that in every season of life, Satan has a plan. And I won't do so, but just look down through verses 1 through 8, pick out maybe 2 or 3 verses or 2 or 3 phrases, and can you look at that and see what Satan's plan is for that season or that time of life? And then could you look back at those same things and say, well, what plan does God have? What has God said about that season, that phase, that time of life? And so that will remind us God is involved, and Satan would like to be involved. Let me just pick out one example. The end of verse 5. There is a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. So Satan has a plan for the time to embrace and to refrain from embracing. God has a plan for that. And so we have a need that creates a need for God's help. The kind of lewd dancing that's so commonplace in our society, even promoted by schools, ignores Solomon's word. There's a time to refrain from embracing. The sexual immorality that is just considered normal in our society. If you were blessed to have godly parents and godly friends, then maybe you were sheltered, and maybe you are sheltered from that, but that's just normal, even to the point that in some parts of our society, parents are expediting that between their children and their daughter and her boyfriend. Well, parents are just saying, well, we're going to go out for the night, and here, y'all just have the house to yourselves, knowing exactly what's going to happen. And they just justify it, well, I'd rather them do that here than in some hotel room. That happens in our society. It's considered normal to that degree. The book of Proverbs, though, describes God's gifts to those who learn the time to embrace, and there is a time, and the time to refrain from embracing. The book of Proverbs deals with both aspects of that. But think about, what would the role be of a fervent, continual prayer? God, I want to know the time to embrace and the time to refrain from embracing. I want to know what is your plan, and I want help because I have an enemy. And we live in a society that certainly is promoting Satan's side of that in a variety of ways. How would continual prayer for God's help just on this one challenge and decision that's so prominent in our society, how would prayer help? Yeah, we need to be reading the Bible. We need to be reading the book of Proverbs. But we need to be praying, and that will help us in every change and every challenge of life. Think about another one that is maybe just of a different kind. In verse 2, the time to be born. Is there a more joyful and stressful time of life than the time to be born? I don't know. Some of you have lived longer than I have. Maybe there is. And maybe it's more joyful and more stressful when it's not you, it's your son or daughter. I don't know. But whatever is the most joyful and stressful, all those elements together in one, think about the role of prayer during the time to be born. Think about how prayer enhances the things that God allows us to enjoy in this life. Because when we share with God in that joy, when we express our gratitude, when we acknowledge His part in that, as Christians we get to enjoy the joyful things of life even more than those who experience the same but who exclude God. We can enjoy nature more than those who exclude God from nature. To them, it's just like a nice accidental painting. But with us, it's, well, my Father did that. The one whom I'm going to spend eternity with did that, and did that for me and with all men. We get to enjoy the joys of life more than all. And then Philippians 4, 6, and 7 reminds us the peace of God that passes understanding. that when we are anxious in nothing, it doesn't mean we don't have questions or distresses. It just means that our anxiety is never stronger than our confidence in God. And if we even start leaning that way, then we pray and we cast our cares on Him, knowing that He cares for us. And so prayer helps to enjoy or enhance the joys and to manage the stresses of life. And again, you could pick any verse in this series, but think about prayer and the time to be born, and just on and on the applications go. This section of Ecclesiastes just touches on every part of life, every change of life, every season of life, every challenge of life. And when we view and think about the changes of life and the challenges of life, then we recognize I've got needs that are just as constant, and then we recognize I have a reason to pray that is just as constant. Then go to Colossians chapter 4. I mentioned we would read this later. Colossians chapter 4 and verse 2 really says almost exactly the same thing that we read from Romans chapter 12. Continue earnestly in prayer. But now read with me through verse 6 and notice what Paul says immediately after urging them to pray. Of course, he wants them to pray for many things, many reasons. But when he brings up the prayer, when he brings up prayer, he immediately moves to what? Read with me the rest of verse 2 down through verse 6. Being vigilant in it with thanksgiving, meanwhile praying also for us, that God would open to us a door for the word to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak. Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. Here, prayer is mentioned in connection with the constant needs of those who are around us, who are lost, who are in their sin, and who are separated from God as a result of that. What are the needs of the lost? They need the forgiveness of sins just as we have. But that also means they need someone who's willing to love them enough to tell them that. Many times they don't recognize it. Who's going to tell them? Who's going to show them what God has said and what their need is? Well, how are we going to tell them? Well, we've got to meet them somewhere. We have to know them somehow. And sometimes they need to know us to some degree in order to have an opportunity to speak with them. So we need to pray for them, but then we need to pray for an opportunity to meet them. And then when we meet them, we need to pray that we'll see the opportunity when it comes up. We probably all have had that in hindsight. Well, I wish I would have said something. I wish I would have fill in the blank. So we need to be praying that we'll recognize an opportunity when it's there. And then as Paul says here, that our speech will be seasoned with salt and that we'll walk in wisdom. Those are things for which we need to pray. How do you view your own work of among your family, among your friends, people you spend the most time with, you have the most opportunities with? How are you doing in making some effort to teach them the gospel? I imagine wherever you would assess yourself, wherever we are, we can do better. We want to do better. And so if I have some need to grow in reaching the lost, then I've got a constant need to pray. And I haven't exhausted that, have I? How many needs do we have? Whatever we can imagine and come up with, what that ought to do is remind us of the continual need to pray. And then the other side of that, we ought to be constantly praying because of constant blessings. I'm going to literally take 10 seconds. You don't have to say it out loud, but literally I want you to sit for 10 seconds and think of as many blessings, count your blessings for 10 seconds just in your head. I'll watch the time. Go. 10 seconds of awkward silence. Okay, I don't know how many you had, but we could have another 10 seconds, another 10 minutes, and our list would grow, wouldn't it? Now, out of those that you thought of on the spur of the moment, how many of those did you have within the first hour that you got out of bed this morning? It didn't even take long, I suppose, at least with some of you. They were already there just the instant you woke up before you had time to do anything. Out of the blessings that you thought of, how many of those were blessings, things that you have? How many of the things that you thought of were things that you recognize were blessings because of what you didn't have? Do you ever think of that? Sometimes we're blessed with what we have. Sometimes it's what we don't have. Sometimes it's not just what has happened to us, what opportunities we do have. Sometimes it's the things that God allows us to avoid that are among our blessings. If we took a whole hour, would we exhaust it? Could anybody make a complete list of your blessings? No. How many ways does God bless us, and we can't even fully know it and understand it? And how many ways and times has God blessed us, and we've forgotten about it? Again, we're all limited. We can't remember every blessing. And so why ought we be constantly praying? Because we are blessed more than at any given moment with any time frame, more than we can even understand and express. And not only do we have the challenge of continuing in prayers of thanksgiving, again, then it's whether it's our own children or those whom we're teaching in the classes or nieces or nephews or any children that we can influence. Part of what we ought to be doing is teaching our children to pray and to give thanks for their blessings and to begin calling their attention to the things that they maybe wouldn't recognize in their youth without someone calling their attention to it. To help them to notice the things that maybe they've always had, that as children, that's normal because that's the way it is for them. But we thank God for those things because not all other children have those things. And because in their life, they may not always have those things. Young children, they can't even imagine a parent dying, a sibling dying. But it happens. And so we teach our children to give thanks for what they have. And at the appropriate age and way, we introduce them to the fact that life is not always, for others, the way that it is for you. And we trust God even if our own life changes. Illnesses turn families upside down. Peace, the peace that we have may not last forever. Sometimes it's a challenge for us to remember those things. The sooner we teach our children these things and we teach them to thank God for those things and to seek His help in those things, the better prepared they are. There's a few occasions where we read of Jesus praying all night. And as I come to those passages from time to time, sometimes I'm amazed how could he pray all night? And then sometimes I wonder why haven't I ever prayed all night? But of course that's not the point. God isn't counting words, God isn't counting minutes. But what God sees and what God knows is, do I continue to pray? Or am I gradually ceasing to pray? Romans 12 and Colossians 4 reminds us to continue. What did these that we've looked at today continue in? What did the apostles continue in? What did the Christians continue in? What did leaders continue in? Let's not be too busy. Let's not be too busy to continue and to grow in the things that are most important. And let's not let, not just this lesson, but all that we have said and heard today, remind us of what is most important. Let's be determined this week, regardless of how well or poorly last week was. Let's continue in these things this week. If you haven't, Have you started doing these things? This morning's lesson involved far more than just prayer. Have you started doing those things? Well, if you've been praying but you're not a Christian, then being outside of Christ means God knows what you're saying, but He doesn't accept your prayers in the same way as He does with those who are His children. Open your songbooks to number 380. If you're not a Christian tonight, we urge you to turn to Christ, to repent of your sins because Jesus is the Christ, to confess Him, to confess your faith because He is the Christ, and be baptized because He is the Christ, and His blood will wash away your sins. If as a Christian you haven't continued in the things you once did, or that you committed to, or you need help and encouragement in continuing, if there's some struggle and we can help you in some way, we're together tonight to continue in His work and to stir each other up to do that. And if our prayers will be of some help in fighting that fight and abiding in Him, come and tell us how we could serve you as we stand and sing.